The night sky was ablaze with streaks of fire as the small reconnaissance vessel plummeted towards the surface of Gaia 4. Inside, Kaylee struggled against her restraints, her eyes wide with panic as the console in front of her flickered erratically. Alarms blared, piercing the chaos of twisting metal and shattering glass. "Stabilizers offline. Hull breach in Sector 3, shouted the ship's AI, its voice unervingly calm amidst the turmoil. Kaylee, gasping for breath, managed a quick scan of the readings. None of it was good news. The ship shuddered violently, a final groan of metal before silence ensued, broken only by the crackling of fire outside the shattered viewport. Kaylee unclasped her harness, her body aching from the rough landing. The cockpit door was jammed, and she had to kick it open, stepping into the cool night air of an alien world. A few meters away from the wreckage, she stumbled upon her survival kit. Its contents were scattered, but most were intact. She grabbed the first aid kit, patched up a few minor cuts, and then scanned the horizon. Tall silhouettes of flora swayed under the twin moon's light, casting long, eerie shadows. As Kaylee surveyed her surroundings, a rustling noise caught her attention. She spun around, her hand reaching for the blaster by her side. "Who's there?" she called out into the darkness, her voice laced with a mix of fear and command. Hey, calm down. I'm not here to hurt you," a voice replied in Galactic Standard. Emerging from the shadow of the towering trees, a man stepped into the moonlight, his hands raised in a peaceful gesture. He was dressed in a simple researcher's uniform, which was slightly tattered at the edges. Kaylee lowered her weapon slightly but kept her guard up. "Who are you?" she demanded, her gaze narrowing. "Name's Jack. I'm a researcher stationed here. Saw your entry burn from my camp. Looked pretty rough. Are you okay?" His tone was friendly, but cautious. Taking a deep breath, Kaylee nodded. "I'm okay, thanks. It was unexpected. I'm Kaylee, from Xyloth. My ship's AI failed, and I got caught in Gaia Ivy's gravity well. This planet wasn't my intended destination." Jack approached slowly, looking over the wreckage. "Well, you're lucky to be alive. Gaia 4 isn't exactly hospitable. Come on, we need to get you away from the wreckage. Could attract scavengers or worse." As they walked, Jack led her towards a safer area where he had set up a makeshift camp. "You'll need a place to rest," he said. "Tomorrow, I can help you salvage what's left from your ship. See if there's anything we can use to send a distress signal or at least get you some shelter." Kaylee, still reeling from the shock of the crash and her sudden companionship, felt a small sense of relief. "Thank you, Jack," she replied, her voice softening. "I'm not sure what comes next, but I'm glad I'm not alone here." They reached the camp, a small, well-hidden clearing with a tent and a fire pit. Jack offered her some food and water, which she accepted gratefully. As they sat by the fire, the light flickering across their faces, Jack asked, "So Xyloth, huh? I've read about it, never visited. What's it like?" Kaylee smiled, warmed by the fire and the conversation. "It's beautiful, forests that stretch on forever, cities that blend with nature. I miss it. And you'll see it again," Jack reassured her. "We'll figure something out in the morning. For now, try to get some rest." As the fire died down and the alien night took hold, Kaylee felt a surprising sense of safety. Despite the dangers that lay ahead, the unexpected friendship offered a glimmer of hope on the foreign planet. Chapter 2, First Contact. As the first light of dawn pierced through the dense canopy of Gaia 4, Kaylee and Jack began their day with a quick breakfast beside the remains of last night's fire. The air was thick with the scent of alien flora, a constant reminder of the unknown world around them. "So, what's the plan for today?" Kaylee asked, tying her boots and readying herself for the day ahead. Jack wiped his hands on a cloth before replying. "First, we need to check your ship for anything salvageable, communication equipment, supplies, anything that might help. After that, we'll need to beef up the camp. Nights are cold here, and the local wildlife isn't exactly friendly." Kaylee nodded, following Jack as they made their way back to the crash site. The wreckage of her ship lay scattered across a small clearing, parts of it smoldering, others completely destroyed. "Looks worse in daylight," Jack commented as they approached the twisted metal. Kaylee sighed, her heart sinking. "Let's see what we can find." Together, they rummaged through the debris. Kaylee directed Jack to what was left of the communications bay, hoping her ship's distress beacon might still be operational. After some digging, Jack pulled out a partially damaged transmitter. "Might be able to fix this," he mused, turning the device over in his hands. "That would be incredible," Kaylee said, a flicker of hope stirring within her. As they continued to search, they talked about their homes, their travels, and the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. Jack was from Earth, a planet Kaylee had only heard of in passing tales and interstellar chatter. "What brought you all the way out here, Jack?" Kaylee inquired, genuinely curious. "I was part of a research team studying uncharted biomes. But after funding cuts, I ended up the last one willing to stay. Guess I wasn't ready to go back to corporate life on Earth," Jack explained, his tone light but sincere. "And you've been here alone ever since?" Kaylee asked, both impressed and concerned. "Yeah, it's been tough, but you learn a lot about yourself when you're the only person for miles," Jack replied with a chuckle. Their conversation was cut short when Kaylee stumbled upon a sealed container under a pile of debris. "Jack, help me with this," she called out. Together, they pried it open to find emergency rations and a medical kit, valuable supplies for their continued survival. "Looks like we won't be going hungry anytime soon," Jack said, smiling. Kaylee smiled back. "Lucky find." With their loot in tow, they made their way back to camp. Along the way, Kaylee paused, looking around at the lush, alien landscape. "It's strange. This place is dangerous, yet it has a certain beauty to it." Jack nodded. "Gaia 4 can be unforgiving, but yes, it's also incredibly beautiful. You start to appreciate the little things, like how the leaves turn towards the sun or the way the rivers sing at night." Kaylee listened, intrigued by Jack's poetic description. "You really have adapted to life here." "It grows on you," Jack admitted. "And hey, now I have someone to share it with." They spent the rest of the day fortifying their camp. Jack showed Kaylee how to weave dense foliage into a protective barrier, and Kaylee taught Jack a few tricks for crafting tools from the wreckage. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over their improved camp, Kaylee felt a surprising comfort. Despite the circumstances, she was grateful for Jack's company, his easy nature making the burden of survival feel a little lighter. That night, as they sat by the new fire, their conversation deepened, sharing fears and dreams under the starlit sky of a world neither of them could have imagined calling home. Chapter 3: Learning to Communicate. Morning on Gaia 4 brought with it a symphony of alien birdsongs and the gentle rustling of leaves. Kaylee woke to the aroma of something cooking over the fire. Jack was already up, stirring a pot with a makeshift spoon. "Good morning," he greeted her with a smile. "Hope you're ready to try some Gaian stew. It's not gourmet, but it'll keep us going." Kaylee chuckled as she approached the fire, stretching out the stiffness from the night. "It smells interesting. What's in it?" "A bit of this, a dash of that," Jack replied cryptically, handing her a bowl filled with the steaming concoction. "Found some tubers and a couple of safe-to-eat mushrooms yesterday. Figured we'd need a good meal to start the day." Taking a cautious sip, Kaylee was pleasantly surprised. "This is actually good, Jack. You've become quite the wilderness chef." Jack grinned. "You learn fast when it's eat or be eaten out here." As they ate, Jack pulled out a battered notebook. "I've been compiling a guidebook of sorts since I got here. It's got notes on the flora, fauna, and a few survival tips. Thought it might help us communicate better, especially about the things around here." Kaylee was impressed. "You wrote all this? It must have taken a lot of time." "Years," Jack confirmed. "But it's worth it. Here, let me show you some basic phrases in the local clicking language used by the vril insects. It's surprisingly effective if you get their attention." Intrigued, Kaylee listened as Jack demonstrated the clicks and pauses of the vril language. She tried mimicking the sounds, causing Jack to laugh. "Not bad for a first try. You might be a natural." They spent the morning practicing. Jack pointed out different objects around them, pronouncing their names in both English and the clicking tongue. Kaylee repeated after him, finding the exercise both challenging and fun. "Okay, your turn," Jack said after a while. "Teach me something in Xylothian." Kaylee thought for a moment, then began teaching Jack how to say friend, tree, and star in her native language. The sounds were soft and lyrical, much like the Xylothian landscape she described. As the day progressed, they used their new linguistic skills while collecting water from a nearby stream. The stream was a beautiful, shimmering blue, lined with stones that seemed to glow under the sun. "This place, it's beautiful but so different from Xyloth," Kaylee remarked, watching the water flow past. "Back home, the rivers are wide and filled with life. Here, it feels more wild, untouched." Jack nodded, understanding. "Each world has its own charm and dangers. Gaia 4 taught me to respect both." They spent the afternoon building a more robust shelter. Using the tools they had fashioned in Jack's guidebook for reference, they managed to create a sturdy structure, interwoven with strong, flexible vines and broad leaves for roofing. "Looks like home," Kaylee joked as they stood back to admire their handiwork. "Better than my first shelter," Jack admitted with a laugh. "I'm glad you're here, Kaylee. It's nice to have someone to talk to, someone to share this with." As the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Kaylee and Jack sat by the fire, their conversation drifting from practical survival to their hopes for the future. Kaylee spoke of her family and friends back on Xyloth, while Jack shared his dreams of exploring more of the galaxy. That evening, as they watched the stars emerge in the alien sky, Kaylee felt a profound sense of connection, not just to Jack, but to the strange, beautiful world around her. Through shared words and shared work, they were forging a bond that transcended the boundaries of their very different lives. Chapter 4. Flora and Fauna. The sun crept over the horizon, casting long shadows through the dense canopy of Gaia 4. Jack and Kaylee, now accustomed to their morning routine, sipped on a freshly brewed concoction of local herbs as they planned their day. "Today, I thought we could explore a bit further into the forest," Jack suggested. "There are areas I've mapped out but haven't revisited in a while. We could use more supplies, and I want to show you some of the unique plants and animals I've documented." Kaylee was eager, her curiosity about this alien world growing by the day. "I'd love that. Lead the way, Jack." As they ventured deeper into the woods, the sounds of unknown creatures echoed around them, a symphony of the wild that Kaylee found both thrilling and intimidating. Jack pointed out various plants, explaining their uses. "This one here," he said, touching a leaf that shimmered with a metallic sheen, "can be used to treat cuts and burns. Saved my skin, literally, more than once." Kaylee listened intently, memorizing each detail. "And these?" she asked, gesturing towards some bright purple fruits. "Edible but not very tasty. Kind of like sour shoes," Jack replied with a grin. "Go on, try one." Kaylee hesitated for a moment before biting into the fruit. Her face puckered instantly. "You're right. Not a fan." Jack laughed and they moved on. A rustling in the bushes caught their attention, and Jack motioned for silence. Slowly, a creature emerged, its skin iridescent, eyes wide and curious. Jack whispered, "That's a gleam fox. Beautiful, aren't they? Mostly harmless if you don't threaten them." Kaylee was mesmerized. The creature studied them for a moment before darting away. "This planet is full of surprises," she remarked, a sense of wonder in her voice. They continued their exploration, collecting samples and recording their findings. Jack showed Kaylee how to extract sap from a tree known for its medicinal properties. As they worked, their hands brushed, and for a moment, they shared a look, a silent acknowledgement of their growing closeness. After filling their packs with various plants, they found a small clearing and sat down to rest. Jack took out his notebook and began sketching a plant they had encountered. "I document everything," he explained. "Helps me feel less alone out here." Kaylee watched him draw, impressed by his attention to detail. "You're really good at this," she said. "Back home, I used to paint. I miss it." Why don't you try? Jack offered her the notebook and a pencil. Go on. Give it a shot. Hesitant at first, Kaylee began to sketch. Slowly, the familiar calm of creating art washed over her. She drew the gleam fox, its lines flowing smoothly under her practiced hand. Jack watched her, appreciative. You're talented, Kaylee. You bring the subject to life. Flattered and a bit embarrassed, Kaylee shrugged. It's just a sketch. No, it's more than that, Jack insisted. It's keeping the beauty of this moment, of our adventure, alive. As the day faded into evening, they made their way back to camp, their conversation light and easy. The sketches and their shared experiences had created a bond that felt both exhilarating and, somehow, inevitable. That night, as they cooked dinner over the fire, the forest around them alive with nocturnal sounds, Kaylee felt a profound peace. Here, with Jack, on this dangerous but beautiful planet, she found a sense of belonging she hadn't realized she was seeking. Together, they had not only survived but had begun to thrive, their shared efforts weaving a tapestry of friendship and perhaps something more. Chapter 5, Under the Moons of Gaia 4. As the sun sank behind the jagged cliffs on the horizon, the air grew cooler, and the forest's daytime cacophony gave way to the softer hum of nocturnal life. Kaylee sat by the fire, gazing at the twin moons rising overhead. Their soft, silvery light bathed the camp in an otherworldly glow, making the alien foliage shimmer. Have you ever seen anything like that? Jack asked, nodding towards the moons as he tossed another log onto the fire. Kaylee shook her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Never. Xylotha's moons are much smaller. They don't light up the night like this. She looked over at Jack, who was poking at the flames with a stick. How long have you been here, Jack? Jack leaned back, propping himself up on his elbows. Almost 3 years. Not by choice at first. My research team was supposed to survey Gaia 4 for 6 months. Then we lost contact with the main fleet, and one by one the others left or didn't make it. I stayed because I didn't have anything to go back to. This place, as dangerous as it is, started to feel like, I don't know, something worth figuring out. Kaylee watched him for a moment, then turned her gaze back to the fire. It's strange, isn't it? How you can end up somewhere you never intended to be, and it changes everything. Jack chuckled softly. I used to think I had my life all planned out. Go to school, get a degree in exobotany, join a research crew, and eventually settle down somewhere nice. Instead, I've spent years dodging predators and scavenging for supplies. He gestured around at the camp. Not exactly the cozy life I pictured. Kaylee laughed, a soft, melodic sound. Well, you've done pretty well for yourself here. This camp feels more like a home than my ship ever did. Jack raised an eyebrow. Your ship? I thought Xylothian vessels were supposed to be top of the line. They are, Kaylee admitted. But a ship is still just a ship. It's not the same as having people to share it with. Her voice grew quieter. I guess I've always been looking for something more. Jack glanced at her, then down at the fire. You're not the only one. I've spent a lot of nights looking at those moons, wondering what's missing. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly, and the forest seemed to lean in, listening. Kaylee shifted closer to the fire, feeling its warmth against the cool night air. She turned to Jack, her expression hesitant. What made you stay all this time, Jack? I mean, you could have tried to leave, to find another way off this planet. Jack tilted his head, thinking. At first, it was stubbornness. I didn't want to admit that I'd failed. Then, it became about the work, cataloging the plants, studying the ecosystem. But after a while, I realized it was something more. I started to feel connected to this place, like it was waiting for someone to really see it, not just run away from it. Kaylee looked at him, her curiosity growing. And now, Jack's eyes met hers, and he hesitated before answering. Now it feels like I'm not seeing it alone anymore. That changes everything. Kaylee's breath caught for a moment. There was something in his tone, an unspoken understanding, a connection she hadn't been prepared for. She looked down at her hands, fiddling with a small piece of driftwood she'd picked up earlier. "It's strange," she said softly. "I've been through so much, and yet, I feel like I can breathe here, with you." Jack didn't say anything right away. He reached out, gently brushing his hand against hers. "Kaylee." She looked up, their eyes meeting in the firelight. Slowly, cautiously, Jack leaned closer. Kaylee didn't pull away. Their faces were inches apart, the forest around them fading into the background. When their lips finally met, it was a gentle, tentative kiss. Kaylee closed her eyes, letting herself be in that moment, feeling the warmth of Jack's hand on hers, the softness of the night. It wasn't hurried or forced, just a quiet affirmation that, against all odds, they weren't alone anymore. When they pulled apart, neither of them spoke at first. Jack ran a hand through his hair, looking both amazed and a little sheepish. "Sorry, Don't be," Kaylee interrupted, a small smile playing on her lips. "I wanted that too." Jack grinned, relieved. "Good, because I didn't really have a backup plan." Kaylee laughed, the sound light and unrestrained. "You don't need one." For the rest of the night, they stayed close by the fire, talking quietly, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams of the future. The moons continued their slow journey across the sky, casting their light over the two unlikely companions who, in the vast loneliness of a death world, had found each other. Chapter 6. The Gathering Storm. The following morning, the air felt heavier. The sky, usually a brilliant mosaic of greens and blues, was now cloaked in a brooding layer of clouds. Jack noticed it immediately as he stirred the campfire back to life. Kaylee joined him moments later, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. "Something's different," Jack said, gesturing at the sky. "Gaia 4 doesn't get storms often, but when it does, they hit hard." Kaylee glanced up, her brow furrowing. "How bad are we talking?" Jack sat back, poking at the fire absently. "I've only seen it once before. Wind strong enough to tear down trees. Rain that turns the ground into a swamp. We'll need to reinforce the shelter if it's anything like last time." Kaylee quickly grabbed a ration bar from their supplies. "Then we'd better start now." The two set to work. Jack led her to a grove not far from the camp where they could cut thick, pliable vines. With makeshift tools they'd fashioned from salvaged ship parts, they worked together to bind the shelter's framework more securely. Kaylee's hands moved deftly, tying knots and weaving the vines through the structure's supports as Jack stabilized the larger beams. "This reminds me of my engineering classes," Kaylee said as she tightened a rope. "Except instead of a controlled environment, we have a wild planet breathing down our necks." Jack chuckled. "Same here. Back in school, we only worried about test deadlines, not wind strong enough to carry off the roof." "How'd you get into engineering anyway?" Kaylee paused, considering. "My parents were both builders. They designed and constructed these beautiful floating habitats on Xylotha's oceans. I wanted to follow in their footsteps, but..." She trailed off, tying another knot. "Life has a way of pulling you in different directions." Jack leaned against one of the shelter's beams, watching her. "And yet here you are, building again." She glanced at him, a faint smile forming. "True. I guess I can't help it. What about you? Did you always want to be a researcher?" "Not at first," Jack admitted. "I wanted to be an explorer. See the galaxy, discover uncharted worlds. Turns out most exploration jobs involve a lot of research, so I figured I'd go all in." "And now?" Kaylee asked, motioning for him to pass her another vine. "Now," Jack said, handing it over. "I just want to stay alive. Everything else feels secondary." Kaylee nodded, understanding more than she expected. They continued working in companionable silence, their movements synchronized as they fortified the walls and roof. By late afternoon, the wind began to pick up, rustling the canopy above them. Jack glanced skyward. "We should check on the water supply. If the storm floods the stream, we'll need to be ready." Kaylee followed him to the nearby creek where they had set up a makeshift filtration system. The water was flowing faster than usual, its surface rippling with the first hints of wind-driven rain. Together, they secured the filtration device, anchoring it to a rock outcropping. "Think it'll hold?" Kaylee asked. "It should," Jack replied, brushing a strand of hair from his face as the wind whipped around them. "But we'll need to keep an eye on it." As they made their way back to the shelter, the first drops of rain began to fall. By the time they reached the camp, it was a downpour. They hurried inside, their clothes soaked, and secured the entrance with a heavy tarp. Inside, the fire was little more than embers, so Jack worked quickly to rekindle it. Kaylee huddled near him, holding a blanket around her shoulders. "I can see why you mentioned this place doesn't get storms often. When it does, it's like the planet wants to make up for lost time." Jack laughed softly. "You're not wrong. First time I went through this, I thought the shelter was going to collapse. But we've done a good job reinforcing it. I think we'll be fine." The wind howled outside, and the walls creaked under the pressure. Kaylee glanced at Jack. "If it weren't for you, I don't know what I'd do right now." Jack turned, a faint smile on his face. "You'd figure it out. You're resourceful. But I'm glad we're in this together." The two of them sat by the fire as it grew stronger, sharing stories to pass the time. Jack told her about the first time he saw Gaia Ivy's enormous mountain ranges, their jagged peaks covered in phosphorescent moss that glowed at night. Kaylee described the glittering glass towers of Xyloth's cities, how they seemed to rise effortlessly from the ocean waves. The storm raged on, but inside the shelter, a sense of camaraderie and mutual trust took root. Every now and then, they would pause their conversation to listen to the rain pounding against the walls, and their eyes would meet, brief, unspoken reassurances that they were safe as long as they were together. At one point, Kaylee shivered, and Jack wordlessly draped another blanket over her shoulders. She looked up at him, gratitude in her eyes, and for a moment, the sound of the storm seemed to fade into the background. As night fell, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Jack and Kaylee prepared for a long night, their shared tasks and easy conversation easing the tension that might have otherwise taken hold. Despite the chaos outside, the shelter felt warmer, more secure than ever before, built not just with vines and beams, but with the growing connection between two people finding their way in an untamed world. Chapter 7. The Rescue Signal. When the storm finally subsided, the world outside the shelter was unrecognizable. Trees had been bent or uprooted, the ground was sodden with rainwater, and a layer of debris covered everything. Jack and Kaylee stood just outside the shelter's entrance, surveying the aftermath. "Well, it could have been worse," Jack said, tossing a broken branch aside. "The structure held. That's something." Kaylee was quieter, her gaze scanning the horizon. "But the camp's a mess. It'll take days to clean up." "True," Jack agreed. "But we're still here. We can rebuild. It's not the first time this planet's thrown us a curveball." Kaylee nodded, though her attention remained on the distance. "We should check the equipment. If we lost any of the gear we salvaged from my ship." "Good call," Jack said, walking over to the small cache they'd stowed in a safer corner of the shelter. He began sorting through the collection of tools, devices, and scavenged parts. "Looks like most of it survived. Even your transmitter's still intact." Kaylee came over, kneeling beside him. "It hasn't worked since the crash. I'd almost forgotten about it." "Well, now might be a good time to try it again," Jack suggested. "If the storm didn't fry it, maybe we can get a signal out." Kaylee hesitated before picking up the damaged device. "What if it does work?" she asked softly. Jack paused, looking at her. "Then someone comes to get you. Isn't that the goal?" "Yes," Kaylee said, her voice barely audible. "It is." She began tinkering with the transmitter, her hands moving with practiced ease. Jack watched, sensing her hesitation but choosing not to press her on it. Instead, he focused on setting up a nearby antenna they'd cobbled together from the ship's remains. "Pass me that spanner," Kaylee said after a few minutes. Jack handed it over. "You're the tech expert here. I'll follow your lead." Kaylee smiled faintly. "You've picked up a lot, you know. I wouldn't have been able to fix half of this without your help." "Well, I've had a great teacher," Jack replied, a touch of humor in his tone. They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds coming from the occasional click of tools and the distant cries of alien wildlife. When Kaylee finally reconnected the last circuit, the transmitter emitted a low hum. "It's powering on," she said, her voice laced with surprise. "I didn't think it would." Jack stood, wiping his hands on his pants. "That's good news. Now what?" Kaylee adjusted a few dials and pressed a series of buttons. "I'll try to send a simple distress message. If anyone's out there listening, they'll pick it up." She hit the transmit button, and a light on the device blinked steadily. Both of them watched it in silence. After a long pause, Jack said, "Now we wait." Kaylee nodded. "Now we wait." The hours that followed were strange, filled with a mix of anticipation and quiet reflection. Jack busied himself by repairing some of the shelter's outer walls while Kaylee kept checking the transmitter for any sign of a response. As the day wore on, Jack noticed that Kaylee seemed more distant than usual. He approached her as she sat by the fire, staring at the blinking light on the transmitter. "What's on your mind?" he asked gently. Kaylee sighed, setting the device aside. "I should be relieved. I should be happy that someone might find me. But I've grown used to this place, to our situation. The thought of leaving feels strange." Jack crouched beside her, his expression thoughtful. "I get it. This world might be dangerous, but it's also become, our home in a way. And we've learned to live here, together." Kaylee met his eyes. "If the signal reaches someone, it might mean going back to my old life. Away from this." She gestured around the camp. "Away from you." Jack swallowed, unsure of how to respond at first. "Kaylee, if someone comes to get you, it'll be because they care about you. They'll want to make sure you're safe. And you deserve that. You deserve to go home." Kaylee searched his face. "And you? What about you, Jack?" He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I'll figure it out. I always do. But that doesn't mean I want you to leave." The air between them grew heavy, their unspoken feelings hanging in the balance. Finally, Kaylee said, "Let's see if someone responds before we jump to conclusions. Maybe they won't come right away. Maybe we'll have more time." Jack nodded. "Fair enough. We'll see what happens." The rest of the evening passed quietly. Kaylee stayed close to the transmitter, while Jack worked on small tasks around the camp. When night fell, the two of them sat by the fire, sharing stories to fill the silence. As the stars emerged above them, Jack glanced over at Kaylee. "No matter what happens, you've changed this place for me. I won't forget that." Kaylee looked at him, her expression soft. "You've changed this place for me too, Jack. More than I ever expected." And so they waited, not knowing what the next day would bring, but finding comfort in each other's presence. The signal was sent, but the future remained uncertain. Just another challenge on a world full of surprises. Chapter 8. A farewell or a new beginning. The transmitter's blinking light continued its steady rhythm as the sun rose again over the horizon. Jack and Kaylee sat nearby, sipping on the last of their gathered water, exchanging occasional glances but saying little. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was just heavy with possibility. Both of them knew what might be coming. When the faint crackle of a response finally came through the transmitter speakers, Kaylee jumped slightly. Jack immediately crouched beside her as she adjusted the dials. A voice, distorted and uneven, broke through the static. "This is the Xyloth Exploratory Fleet responding to distress signal. Please confirm identity and coordinates." Kaylee's breath caught. Her hands hovered over the controls, trembling slightly, before she pushed the transmit button. "This is Kaylee of the Xyloth Research Vessel Stargazer. I'm transmitting from Gaia 4. She stopped herself, her gaze darting to Jack. Jack gave her an encouraging nod. "Go ahead," she continued, her voice steadying. "I am alive and safe. I'm with another survivor, and we've established a secure camp." There was a pause on the other end before the voice returned. "Message received, Kaylee. A recovery team is en route. Estimated arrival within 24 hours. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving only the faint hum of the device. Kaylee stared at it, her mind racing. 24 hours, she whispered. That's soon. Jack stood and rubbed the back of his neck, looking out at the forest. Well, at least you know they got the message. Kaylee turned to face him. Jack, she trailed off, unsure of how to say what was racing through her head. Jack offered a faint smile. Hey, it's a good thing, right? You'll get to go home. But what about you? She asked, her voice soft. What happens to you once they come? Jack shrugged. I'll keep on doing what I've been doing. Surviving. Exploring. Maybe I'll even write that book I've been joking about. Kaylee reached out and touched his arm, stopping him from moving away. You could come with me. Jack's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful expression. And go back to a world that isn't mine? Back to rules and systems I've been away from for so long? I'm not sure I'd fit in. Maybe you'd fit in better than you think, Kaylee replied, her grip tightening slightly. You don't have to stay here. Jack exhaled and looked at her, really looked at her, as though weighing her words carefully. And what about you? Are you ready to leave this place behind? Kaylee opened her mouth to answer but hesitated. Was she ready? She thought about everything they had built together, shelters, systems, routines. More than that, she thought about the bond they had formed, the quiet moments by the fire, the adventures through the alien landscape. It wasn't just a camp they'd made. It was something more. I don't know, she admitted, but I know I don't want to leave you here alone. Jack looked away for a moment, as if considering his next words carefully. Kaylee, you have a home out there. Family. A future. Don't give that up because of me. You've got so much waiting for you beyond this planet. And you don't? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. You deserve a future too, Jack. He smiled faintly, a bittersweet expression. My future's here. It's not what I expected, but it's what I've made. And I'm okay with that. Kaylee fell silent, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She wanted to argue, to convince him to come with her, but she also knew Jack well enough by now to understand that his mind was made up. He had chosen this life, and while it wasn't easy, it was his choice. The day passed in a blur of preparations. Kaylee packed what little she had, double-checked the transmitter's signal, and made sure everything was ready for when the recovery team arrived. Jack helped without hesitation, his usual cheerful demeanor masking whatever he might have been feeling. When evening came, they sat by the fire one last time. The light of the twin moons cast long shadows, and the air was filled with the chirping and clicking of alien creatures. Kaylee stared at the flames, her thoughts racing. Jack, ever observant, broke the silence. It's been quite the journey, hasn't it? He said, his voice calm but tinged with something deeper. Kaylee turned to him, her eyes searching his. It's not over yet. Not for me. And it doesn't have to be over for you. Jack reached out and placed a hand over hers. Kaylee, you've given me more than you know. I don't regret a single moment we spent together. But you have to go. You have to live the life you were meant to live. Her chest tightened, but she nodded. I'll never forget you, Jack. And I'll never forget you, he replied, squeezing her hand gently. You've made this place feel less empty. The rest of the night passed in quiet conversation, laughter, and a shared sense of something neither could quite put into words. When the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, a soft hum filled the air, the unmistakable sound of a recovery ship's engines approaching. Jack and Kaylee stood side by side, watching as the sleek vessel descended through the morning mist. Kaylee's heart raced, a mixture of relief and sadness. When the hatch opened and the recovery team emerged, she turned to Jack one last time. Goodbye, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Goodbye, Kaylee, Jack replied, his own voice steady but soft. Take care of yourself out there. She nodded and stepped onto the ship. The hatch closed, and as the vessel lifted off, Kaylee looked through the small viewport. Jack was still standing there, watching her go. The image stayed with her as the ship carried her away, her mind replaying every moment they had shared on Gaia 4. And though their paths now diverged, she knew that what they had built together, friendship, Trust, something far deeper, would stay with her, no matter how far she traveled.